evening. Welcome to another edition of the Open Night. It is January the 22nd, 2021. I'm Peter, joined with my co-host as usual, Adam.
Hello.
We have a very packed schedule per usual, with lots of events happening in the global world, and we'll get first to it. And our first mention of today is Joe Biden's first week in office. Joe Biden was inaugurated this past Wednesday. With no violence in the Capitol, which was a very refreshing sight, and has, in the last few days, passed 17 executive orders dealing with wide-ranging issues of the U.S. joining the Paris Climate Accords again, the Mexico City policy on abortion, and other fun-ranging issues across the political spectrum. Of course, some of the more controversial decisions that have slowly packed out of this week have been a federal ban on oil, on federal, acceptance of new oil allowances to drill on federal land. Others also being the cancellation of the Keystone Pipeline, which has enraged the Canadian government. But on terms of the executive orders, Joe Biden is doing as he promised at the election to reverse many of the Trump-era decisions, and he's very much fast forward on his processing of doing that, which, of course, has been led by praise of Democrats, who, of course, now control Congress, but has also been met with, especially on the energy policy, criticism from all wings of the Republican Party on said policy. First thoughts, Adam?
Yeah, so there is a lot to digest here because ultimately it is following exactly what Biden said he'd do on his first few days of office. And it really does just represent this sort of progressive outlook that he set out. And I mean progressive in more of looking at it in an international sense, because weirdly enough, despite what someone would assume when looking at a character like Joe Biden, he's one of the most progressive world leaders. Looking at, some of the decision making and these executive orders towards climate change and how to deal with an environmental response, they're some of the most progressive in the Western world, which is a fascinating outlook to see. Definitely a major contrast to the politics we saw with Donald Trump. There's also some other major stuff, such as reversing the Trump administration's restrictions on US entry for passport holders from 7 Muslim majority countries, so-called Muslim ban. Then there was the stopping the United States withdrawal from the World Health Organization, so seeing possibly how the United States tried to reclaim some international influence in the health scene, because there have been major contentions about how, pro-China, is a way to word it. The WHO has sort of made itself seen. So seeing if the United States can sort of reverse that. And yeah, as you stated, one of the more amusing things is cancelling the Keystone XL pipeline, primarily because I saw a great joke on Twitter where it was Justin Trudeau being led around by progressive firebrand upstart Joe Biden. I think, it does just lend itself to show that this is definitely going to be quite, a unique presidency in terms of some of the agenda it's going to be pursuing. Something we haven't really seen, and even Barack Obama was lacking on in a number of ways. Peter, what do you think of these as an overall outlook?
Well, I think, as someone pointed out, I think this is really the Obama third term, but just with someone who understands the system much better than Barack Obama. I think one of Obama's big failings was, for all the hope and change he ran on, he was not very effective in the office of getting things done as president in terms of EOs and legislation. Joe Biden is obviously a creature of Washington. He's been there almost 50 years now. He knows the Senate. He's chaired many influential committees, and he very much is aware. I mean, look, Joe Biden, in my personal opinion, is one of the more progressive presidents to take over the office of the presidency in modern times, and I think he is on a mission as a man who's been in Washington for a long time, in his opinion, to transform America. So what he sees fit for it to be. Pardon me. And I do think Biden obviously wants to get his agenda rolling. And obviously, he has a trifecta, though very narrow in both chambers. And he wants to obviously have, unlike his boss, a legacy to run on in 2 years, because Barack Obama's main legacy at the 2010 midterms was Obamacare, which at the time was unpopular. So Biden's bet is to inevitably make progressive legislation on, as we've seen with the COVID relief package, to win over voters again at the midterms and try to keep his majorities in both chambers or minimize losses. And I think what we're seeing is Joe Biden ran on what he said. I mean, Joe Biden, and I know there were a lot of takes saying Joe Biden was this moderate, who was going to come in office, be the return of third way. I disagree with that. Joe Biden was never third way. Joe Biden is a progressive who has very much the intent on putting progressive policies in at the White House, and that again is what the United States voted for, and that's obviously now up to the the schisms and mechanisms of Congress to determine what passes and what doesn't pass.
Do you think there's going to be, sort of looking towards the future, do you think there's going to be any major holdup for the kind of legislative reform he wants to bring forward, and what sort of reform would that look like?
I do think there'll be a lot of it. I mean, we've started to see this week, for all the talk there's been about the Republican Civil War, that Joe Biden, it seems in about 2 days, has unified the Republican Party to something that hasn't been arguably in the last few years, of a unified message. I think, look, the Senate's going to be very interesting because it's a 50-50 Senate. There's no power sharing agreement yet reached, and the main contention there is the filibuster. Mitch McConnell wants an assurance, it seems now written assurance from Chuck Schumer, that the filibuster will not be nuked in any situation. Obviously, the assumption is of many is that Republicans will use the filibuster to slow down or try to kill Democratic legislation that in their eyes may be too extreme. Republicans, especially Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, have criticized the Biden proposal on COVID, saying it's too much money. Republicans have criticized his agenda on immigration as being way too generous. And they've also criticized the House Resolution 1 bill, which deals with voting rights, as being way too much of a federal overreach. So I think we're going to see contention. I mean, Biden, obviously, being the creature of Washington, is going to try to work better with Republicans than, say, Obama did, because he doesn't want an antagonized relationship to come back to bite him should he lose control of either chamber. But I do think we're going to be very much, seeing a lot of standoffs in the Senate, and potentially the threat of the Senate going nuclear, which again has a lot of ramifications for the midterms and the future of the chamber itself.
So just in case anybody here who is listening isn't aware of what going nuclear means in terms of relating to the filibuster, could you just give like a brief idea of what?
Yeah, so the United States Senate operates under a filibuster system. The filibuster is senators can talk and try to kill things to death. So prior to 2014, all nominations to the United States Senate and legislation required 60 votes. If you did not have 60 votes, the filibuster could kill legislation. In 2014, that rule was changed by Democrats at the time to try to get Obama judges on circuit courts and captain picks to go faster, because Republicans were holding them up. So the rule was changed from 60 to just a simple 51 votes. The argument at the time from Democrats was it was fairness. The argument from Republicans and certain Democratic senators was this was just a path to inevitable destruction. In 2017, Mitch McConnell, who is mentioned earlier, changed the filibuster rule on Supreme Court nominations to 51 in light of Justice Gorsuch's nomination being filibustered at the time, and also reduced the ability of the minority party to argue on that. So what we have left now on the filibuster is that most legislation must be approved if it wants to be on the floor by 60 votes to break a filibuster. The problem is Democrats only have 50 votes on the floor and 51 if you count Harris. That's nowhere near what they need to break a filibuster. And from it looks like they won't be getting a lot of Republican help on many of their bills. So going nuclear would mean Democrats would have a simple vote on the floor of getting rid of the filibuster on major legislation and making it 51 votes to pass major legislation. What this means is stuff like stuff like immigration, the Biden relief package, or anything that he has up would no longer be in any threat of being held up by the minority. Of course, the flip side of this is that in the long run, that means when there's another Republican trifecta, a Republican trifecta could pass whatever it sees fit, because there's no longer a filibuster to stop them as passing it. So that would be going nuclear in a sense. It would make the Senate function more like the House of Representatives, and it remove the last bit of minority power left on bills.
Thank you so much for that explanation. I hope that was useful for anybody here. Okay, so that I have nothing else to add on the overall first few days. So I think we should head on to our
Yes.
next story in North America,
Yes.
which is Canada's Governor General resigning. Now, this follows an external report which found that the Queen's representative, that being the Governor General, which is a largely ceremonial role, had overseen a toxic work environment in which staff were bullied, in quotes, to tears. The report, which was released earlier, I think it was last week,
Yes.
basically painted a very bad picture for the Governor General's leadership, and even questioned her role specifically in this kind of toxic work environment in which she had even taken part in. So what this means now is that there is no Governor General in Canada. Particularly, there's an acting one, but there's no like officially appointed one. This is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, there had never been a precedent for a Governor General in Canada being forced to resign. And her unprecedented departure from the job follows previous allegations that she had bullied staff at her official residence and even on foreign trips. So there is a very wide range here of allegations being made, which have been taken very seriously, as we can see with the resignation. And a very interesting case, before I pass it along to Peter for his thoughts, is that the president of the Institute for the Study of the Crown in Canada gave a very interesting insight into why he sort of thought this situation arose. So he said, in the case of this Governor General being appointed, there was no due diligence in why she was being appointed. The Prime Minister, that being Justin Trudeau, didn't determine if she was really appropriate for the job, and his words were created a disaster. So he also says that he urges the Prime Minister to take a sober second thought. There's no need to rush. So definitely quite a stunning indictment of Justin Trudeau's leadership in appointing the Governor General here. But Peter, what do you think of the general situation?
Yeah, I mean, the report itself was very damning on the Governor General's behavior. The Governor General is Julie Payette, who was, put in office by Mr. Trudeau. Of course, there were many concerns the moment she was nominated about her ethical behavior. In 2011, she was charged with second-degree assault in Maryland. However, that never went forward, and there were many character questions raised about her appointment and qualifications to the role. Of course, what's been alleged, of turning, the Governor General's office, which has historically been a very, respectable place to work in Canada, into basically a hellhole, is very much an indictment against her character. And the pressure for her to resign. I mean, there had been pressure building up for months in many circles of Canada for her resignation. And as Adam pointed out, it is very, very rare for a Governor General to resign and not fill out their terms. I mean, if my memory serves me correct, the last Governor General to resign their term and not finish it out in a Commonwealth country, I believe, was Sarah Kerr of Australia, who is more infamously known as the man who, was proceeding over the constitutional crisis there in the 70s. But yeah, it's very rare to see this resignation of a Governor General. Mr. Trudeau now has to find a new Governor General who will obviously have to be, a good caliber now because of the, what his first pick not working. Of course, the Governor General can be anyone in a sense, so it could be former politician, former astronaut, former military, head or academic or whatnot. So it's going to be interesting to see who he decides to choose as his next Governor General. Many names have been floated around. Prince Harry has been floated a bit. Though I would probably bet, that probably would not occur due to the principle since the 1950s of Commonwealth countries of a native being the person in charge. So it'll be interesting to see who the replacement is. If Mr. Trudeau decides to nominate someone, of a, very high background to be, the replacement, or does he give it to someone in the political spectrum who is well respected on all sides of the aisle as basically as a safe pick? It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just looking back to sort of the involvement of Justin Trudeau, this, as you stated, this sort of build up to this report had been going on for quite a while now. And Justin Trudeau had made statements in which he fully supported the Governor General, as would be expected in these kinds of builds up to scandals of this caliber, where the person who appointed them is quite friendly towards said person and is supportive of the position and hopes they don't fully believe what's gone on and all of that. So it will be definitely interesting to see if this kind of scandal has any impact on the Canadian Liberal Party's polling position. Currently, they're doing pretty well despite all of the scandals that currently seem to plague Justin Trudeau's premiership. But will definitely be interesting to see if this is one thing that will really get them. I suspect probably not, given that most people in Canada don't really know what the Governor General does. But what I saw an interesting quote in The Guardian, which said that this was despite how bad the scandal represents, at least it was giving Canada an overview of what the Governor General does and why it's important as an institution. So again, that's another interesting aspect to it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It should be noted, of course, one interesting element is Mrs. Payette was chosen by Mr. Trudeau on his own recommendation. Historically, previous Governor Generals have been chosen by a committee of recommendation to the Prime Minister. So it'll be interesting to see if that is maintained in this situation, or whether Mr. Trudeau just unilaterally chooses a replacement. And just to an earlier point, the Australian Governor General was Sir John Kerr, who I couldn't remember his first name. That was the last one from White Research, who resigned early on in their term. But moving on from this, last week we mentioned the CDU leadership election, arguably the most powerful party position in the mainland of Europe because of its long continuous streak of serving in German governments. On the weekend, Armin Laschet, the president of North Westphalia, won the leadership of the CDU over Friedrich Merz in a rather okay-ish margin, not great margin. He now will, in March, go for a joint meeting of the CDU and CSU, and will be a favorite to be the chancellor candidate. So for those who may ask, so the CDU and CSU are a joint partnership, coalition parties who run under a banner. So part of the agreement is the CSU gets to run all its candidates in Bavaria. CSU, the Christian Social Union Party, is a Bavarian party. The CDU, for the rest of Germany's states, gets to run its candidates unopposed. And they tend to, they combine each other into the Bundestag to be one parliamentary group in a sense. So now Mr. Laschet has won, very much the Merkel continuous candidate. However, even with his win, there are still a lot of questions with Mr. Laschet, especially on his foreign policy. Mr. Laschet in the past has made lovely comments defending Bashar al-Assad's use of force against Syrian rebel groups. He has defended Mr. Putin and talked very openly about having a reset of Russian relations. He has also spoken very positively about China, which is very interesting considering the new administration in Washington is very much trying to fight China's influence in Europe. So very much a headache for the incoming administration. Mr. Laschet, of course, the other issue is he's very gaffe pro. Mr. Laschet is not notoriously known for being very, as they say in politics, eloquent in terms of knowing what to say and what not to say. And this has, of course, risen now the increased pressure on Markus Söder, who is the Minister President of Bavaria, to be the joint candidate here of the center-right parties. Currently, the CDU center-right bloc is currently ahead in the polls by double digits. The second closest group are the Greens, who have been in the 20s, 20 or 21 range, and increasingly look like that if there was an election today, that the CDU would probably be the largest party, give or take whether they gain seats, keep their seats, or lose a little bit of seats. And the Greens would be in the second place, which is very important in one regard. Mr. Laschet is very much more of the type of candidate at the CDU that the Greens would get along with, as he's basically Merkel 2.0 continued, and allows for an easier coalition. Now, one note to be here is even though Mr. Laschet did win, the margin has many on the more moderate side of the party worried that the right wing of the party is going to become more influential now because of the more protest vote that is seemingly occurring, it seems, at every CDU leadership election of the right wanting more influence. So there's now an interesting question now whether Mr. Laschet, if he does form a government, does he give more right-wingers in the CDU, unlike Merkel, more prominent posts in his government to try to calm down a rebellion? Friedrich Merz, the runner-up, basically begged for to become the economics minister of Germany. That was both declined by him and Mrs. Merkel, who still has that control. Mr. Röttgen, who is now a part of the CDU advisory board, is very likely to be tipped for a job, the other leadership contender. So it'll be interesting to see, the CDU has chosen the more moderate path over the more right-wing path, which has a big influence now in Europe in international relations. Adam, thoughts?
So, yeah, your points on foreign policy are especially interesting because quite, surprising to a lot of people more in Western Europe and in the United States, for example, don't realize that there is a significant portion of the German public who don't mind working with Russia and don't mind working with China. There's this idea of foreign neutrality, something that obviously is still able to keep up with their membership of NATO. But as you can see with the current German administration, they're able to go through this while also seeking German pipelines to their country. So there are obviously mixes around with it. I mean, you've also the fact that he has also the new CDU leader has been less critical in tone towards Washington than Angela Merkel was in some situations, and he's stressed that he intends to improve transatlantic cooperation on climate, which obviously is a big area for Joe Biden, and trade. So clearly there are very clear different sides to what we're going on about. And as you state, yes, he is definitely more on the moderate side. And what that actually means for any possible election, whether they would have to form some kind of coalition with the German Green Party, would also be especially interesting because it definitely looks like it'd be more of a possibility that could take place. And your point about the influence of the right wing in the CDU is especially interesting as well, because how is this dynamic going to play where maybe he has to appeal to them more, but also he has to form a coalition with sort of a Green Party, which obviously is far more progressive than any of these right wing members. So there definitely is a very interesting, unique dynamics that's going to have to form, and it will be a situation which will be quite hard to overcome, and how he does it will be especially fascinating to follow along with. If he even becomes the chancellor, I think is another point to stress, because he has not the best base to work upon. He isn't that popular. There are far more popular candidates, as you stated. The state president of Bavaria is far more popular than him. But then again, the party is uniting around Laschet. So yeah, we have an interesting dynamic there, and we'll see if he is someone who is able to go along and actually survive and actually become chancellor.
Yeah, and I think the point about the membership, I think, is interesting. I mean, the leader was chosen by delegates, though one could argue if it was the full membership of the CDU, we could have very easily had a different result than the one we did have. And it now would be fascinating, of course. I mean, Mrs. Merkel was notoriously known for, while being on the center right, of copying a lot of parties' other ideas in cabinet. This particularly annoyed the SDP and FDP, and respectively, when they served under her, of many of their more popular ideas basically getting recycled under her. So it'll be interesting to see if Laschet tries doing that. How does he, as you mentioned, balance that with the right that is getting more and more impatient with the leadership, basically, because in their minds they want a return to the good old days. Of her, in the Kohl style CDU, the free market, Catholic social conservatism of Germany, which in their minds is slipping, and they want to return to it. So it's an interesting dynamic how they're going to deal with that. With a Green, almost certainly likely, if they go into coalition with the Greens, how that dynamic would balance out.
Yeah, and well, I mean, just a final point to make on it. It's not, like the CDU has been inexperienced with having to work with centre left and left wing partners. They have to do it for a lot of their governing experience. Grand coalitions in Germany with their centre left Social Democratic Party are not uncommon. They're in fact quite likely. So yeah, very it'll be interesting to see how that's carried forward.
And an interesting, just one last bit on this, I think will be interesting is for the other parties. I mean, the effect, for the SDP, maybe this helps them get a few points, but the SDP looks like it's very much on the way out of wanting to be involved in the word government at all, unless there's a left of center government were to be formed between the SPD, the Greens, and Die Like, but that seems kind of unlikely and unable to reach the magic number, whatever that may be in the Bundestag for a majority. And maybe this has helped the FDP get some more right-wing members of the CDU to cross over. That also remains to be seen.
Yes, indeed. And speaking to when we previously mentioned Russia, I will always try and find some kind of way to create a segue between our previous topic and then we're going on to. Russia's leading opposition figure, Alexei Navalny, has been arrested and detained for what they say is 30 days. I imagine will be far more, and he'll probably be sentenced to a very long trial after returning to Moscow for the first time since he was poisoned last year. So the 44-year-old lawyer, who is a major opposition leader, creating a variety of social media videos to strike out against the Russian government, to organizing protests, is now stuck in a notorious Moscow prison, pending the outcome of 4 legal matters, which he states are all cooked up, and accuses Putin of ordering his attempted murder, that being the poisoning, back last year. Now, Putin's response, not that it really matters given the dictator status, has dismissed his allegations, and instead is claiming that Navalny is part of a US-backed dirty tricks campaign to discredit him. So the real interesting thing that follows this is Navalny's allies have worked and formed nationwide protests, which are set to take place, I believe, tomorrow, if I have my news correct, and possibly days later, to try and pressure the Russian government to order the release of Navalny, and also to try and really push against the Russian response to the coronavirus pandemic, which they state has been incredibly lacking. So yeah, just to, I guess, summarize this story beyond the arrest, we're really seeing this situation here where, once again, a major opposition leader is popping its head up in Russia, is trying to create some systematic change, sometimes succeeding, and in other situations not living up because of the repressive nature of the state. And ultimately, we're seeing now that, with all opposition leaders who have tried to do this exact thing, there are harsh consequences which follow. Peter, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it was very bold of him to go back to Russia. I mean, I would be quite candid in saying if I were in his situation, I would have not even dared to go back to Russia due to the notorious, thing of opposition leaders turning up dead after, the first time not dying. But, guts to him. I mean, he, was very gutsy in going back to the airport, saying, I'm back and you're not going to try to stop me. And they arrested him. Now, unfortunately, it's been reported he's starting to feel ill again, which in Russian terms means that something has obviously been injected into him. Again, I'm not trying to cause an international thing here. I'm just going by what that means in Russian. But again, I think he's a courageous figure. He's, very much criticized this regime, because that is what Mr. Putin is, a regime, a czar, conduct in Russia. But, this is Russia, and strong men find their ways to stay in power. And I do worry that Mr. Navalny is not going to be able to get out of this time of Russia, and he's either not going to make it, alive, or he's going to be put in jail for a long time and very much tortured for these views because of going against what I call Tsar Putin's, mandate of what he thinks is right for Russia.
Exactly. So, it will be concerning if it does end up in the unfortunate situation where he is sentenced to prison with no overall understanding of what is going to be happening to him in that situation. So yes, we can only hope that if people are able and willing to take to the streets, but as I stated, the repressive nature of the Russian state means that a lot of that is very unlikely. And I imagine once again, like we've seen all across the world with authoritarian regimes during the coronavirus pandemic, they will use the healthcare concerns that it presents to really shut down any form of civil liberties. So yes,
he is very good at doing that, sadly.
Yeah, even if there isn't a coronavirus pandemic going on, they still work their way in there.
Indeed. Anyway, moving on from Russia, we move to another lovely thing, and that is the Olympics. The Olympics that were supposed to have happened last summer that were canceled because of coronavirus have been in the news this week. The Times, the British paper, have stated from high sources of the Japanese government that they believe this year's games will be canceled because of the virus still not being as equally in a better state as they hoped, and that there may not be enough vaccines ready for all the athletes at the games. Of course, the report says that they would be canceled and that Japan would put a bid for the 2032 games. However, this was immediately pushed back by many different groups. The Japanese government said this was falsely incorrect. The United States Olympic Committee, arguably very important in terms of this because its major network, NBC, is at times the main hub of the International Olympic channel streaming in the world, said that it had not received any information about a cancellation. And the Olympic Committee itself has said it has no plans of canceling the Olympic Games. Their plan, as they've stated now firmly, is to hold the Games in July of 2021, this year. Now, there, of course, is still the pandemic. However, we are in the vaccine rollout. Japan, of course, has, I believe, started its vaccine rollout, albeit with very slow success, which has caused the current government a lot of morale in terms of standing in the pandemic. But for Japan, this is extremely important to host these games. The previous Abe government had put a lot of effort in to win these games the first time, to showcase Japan as this new Asian, tech power that was ready to, become a symbol of the world again. And delaying or not even being able to host an Olympic game would be a huge moral blow, and also a financial blow for the city of Tokyo, which has also put a lot of effort into preparing for an Olympics Games, because these Olympic Games, while costly and controversial for a city like Tokyo, bring a lot of money and tourists historically to that. Obviously, the second part's probably not going to happen, but just playing the games would be a huge morale booster for arguably a world that needs a lot of morale boosting.
I mean, the interesting aspect here is you mentioned former Prime Minister Abe's real interest in getting the games to go along. The current Prime Minister Suga isn't that interested at all in having the games organized. Now, as stated, his government has denied these claims, saying that of course they'll go ahead and that there won't be any major cancelling to them. But really, to the people of Japan and specifically Tokyo, in a recent poll, it showed that roughly 80% of them either wanted them delayed or cancelled altogether. So we really see that the political class is kind of apathetic towards it, despite sort of what it would represent. And then we have the other situation where the public themselves in Japan are also quite apathetic too towards if they should go ahead or not. And it really does represent a sort of negative for sporting internationally, as you have all of these athletes that have spent years and years and years preparing exactly for this one event, for all of it just to disappear because of how much preparation has to go into the Olympics for it to be delivered. And if they're cancelled, to try and organize it to which the next Olympics takes place, there'll be a lot of space in between where people aren't able to go out and support their favorite athletes. So definitely an issue there. And as I just said, that it's been denied. The Tokyo metropolitan government as well have denied the claims that they're going to be cancelled. But overall, having seen the public and political classes disinterest, who knows where this situation will be in the next few weeks, few months, and year.
And I mean, there's already been the report that they've already conceded there may not be any spectators at all for these events, which is again another changing of the thing. I mean, Japan's government back in the winter said. Back in the fall of last year, said that they would hope to have some sort of fans there. Now they've all but conceded that's likely not going to be a case. But yeah, it's an interesting scenario, as Adam mentioned, of many of the residents of Tokyo and any of the residents of Japan, citizens of Japan, really don't care or really just want this pushed off. In the cabinet who pushed for these games. I mean, the prime minister. From what's been reported, was not very keen when he was chief cabinet secretary of pushing ahead for these games. a lot of this is an Abe legacy go online. Since Mr. Abe really wanted to have an Olympic Games, since the last Summer Games in Japan, if I recall correctly, were in 1964, I want to say. So for the country, for a lot of its ruling class, this is especially an event that they'd like to go ahead, more as a morale booster. But again, we shall see if they do carry along with this. If they do, it's a humongous achievement for Japan to pull off the biggest sporting event in the world in a pandemic. Though there will also be the controversy of how does the vaccine rollout works. Do all the athletes have to be vaccinated on site, or is the IOC going to mandate that all athletes be vaccinated in their countries of origin, which in turn means that many of these smaller countries that historically compete at the games may not be able to send anyone if they don't have their vaccine rollout ready and going. And a lot of the European countries are way behind, where a lot of other countries are. I mean, the European Union countries have still not even rolled out their phase 1 of their vaccine compared to the United Kingdom or the United States or Canada.
Indeed, indeed. And it will also be interesting to see how they tackle the less internationally, I guess recognized would be the term, vaccines from China. I don't believe Russia's, I should have researched this beforehand, but I don't believe Russia is allowed to take place in these upcoming Olympics.
The Russian athletes would be under the unaffiliated flag. So yeah, Russia as a whole would not be at the Olympics, but they'd be flying under the IOC banner.
Right, okay, fantastic. Yeah, so they're banned for 4 years to include 2021. Okay, cool. Right, anyway, so I was going to see if that vaccine is something that they accept, because a lot of African countries have been accepting specifically the Chinese virus because the Western world isn't been providing it the same, I guess, yeah, exactly. So there's possible questions there. I don't know what kind of policy work would have to go there, but that's an interesting route to lead on.
Yeah, and I mean, just on the vaccine, just not to bore this topic to death, but the Chinese vaccine from Charles in Brazil isn't as effective as its other counterparts. So that also raises another problem for the IOC. Do you mandate the Pfizer, Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson one, because Johnson & Johnson seems ready to make their own shot, as the standard 3 that will be allowed in? And do you say to any Chinese athlete, you must take those 3 or else you're not allowed in? Another headache that they have to deal with down the road.
Exactly. And if that's everything on the topic that you want to say for, we now go to our coveted African story. And this time it is a specifically very concerning one, which relates to the Central African Republic, in which a state of emergency has been declared as the army and UN forces try to repel advancing rebel groups who want to overthrow the government. These anti-government fighters, who roughly control about 2/3 of the country, mainly small towns, villages, wide areas, have surrounded the capital and are trying to push down onto it. So why is this very concerning situation happening? It's very reminiscent of the overthrow of the government in 2013, which led to essentially a state of anarchy. So yes, why is it happening this time? Well, it's because rebels dispute the validity of the recent presidential election that took place last month, which brought in, and I excuse my pronunciation here, President Faustin Archange Touadera. I'm going to guess I'll just say the CAR president in the future. Anyway, so this coalition group is formed from a very wide variety of different militia groups. And essentially, they formed an alliance a few months ago and launched an offensive in a bid to disrupt the election prior to it even taking place. So since the election, fighting has continued in towns nationwide, with rebels threatening, as I stated, to march onto the capital. And so far, they have been kept away by United Nations peacekeepers, and then you also have the army's forces, as well as reinforcements from Russia and Rwanda. So another interesting angle you've got going on there. So the political opposition of this coalition states that the president's victory lacks legitimacy and are demanding a rerun. which is quite interesting given that they were the ones to disrupt it, but here we are. So while voters turned out in the capital and some other small towns which weren't disrupted, the militants launched a violent and disruptive campaign to try and essentially stop. So this involved burning ballot boxes, ransacking polling stations, intimidating election officials, and this prevented over 40% of electoral districts in the country to simply not be counted and involved in the vote. So this rebel alliance calls itself the Coalition of Patriots for Change. So now, despite being new as a group, it contains a number of key figures who ousted President Bozizé in 2013. So that year is specifically interesting. I say interesting is probably the wrong word. It is a situation which could develop very much like this one, in which you see a rebel group possibly get into this situation where they can overthrow a government. So just drawing back to this very confusing situation. So a key figure amid this very confusing mayhem is the previous president who was ousted in 2013, Bozizé. He is a former general who seized power in a 2003 coup before being toppled in 2013. So he fled the country, allegedly supporting what he's now being alleged to support and essentially act as an organizer for this group who has engaged in trying to stop the election. So, yeah, as I stated, a very, very confusing situation, given that it stemmed from an election in which there was significant violence, disruption, general havoc, which meant it wasn't able to fully take place. And really, it seems like the reason why this rebel group was so frustrated by the political system that they wanted to stop it is because Bozizé was barred from actually running in the election, which therefore sort of goes back to this idea of why they want to rerun it. They want to have him as a candidate this time. So yes, overall, a situation which is developing constantly, and we will definitely be reporting on the situation next week, and if it develops any further in the next weeks ahead, and marks a very, very concerning change in a very significant and unstable country.
Yeah, I fully agree with that analysis. I mean, the Central African Republic has very much been a hot zone of instability in numerous decades. So this concerning reports about rebel groups taking over towns and also being on the outskirts of Bangui is very concerning. And with the whole democratic system now also in trouble, and the other characters at play, is putting the country in a very grave situation. And there have also been, criticism reports that certain foreign countries have been involved in the destabilization. Again, those are only unconfirmed reports. Again, we don't know. I mean, as Adam mentioned, Mr. Bozizé, who was president from 2003 to 2013, has been alleged to be the person behind this. He denies that. And that, again, should be taken with all its caveats. But, yeah, I mean, since December, according to the UN, 200,000 civilians have been directly affected by the fighting, which is a very concerning thing. There have been calls for more UN peacekeepers, though those are very effective historically at doing nothing. I didn't throw in that jab at the UN. But yes, Central African Republic is in a very dangerous situation. And it's a very dangerous thing when you start having, rebel groups backed by certain large percent of the population challenging the results of an election that, for the most part, was considered okay by foreign observers, not perfect. It's just, a concerning thing. And hope is that, if this doesn't spiral out of control, but if it does, that certain there is a mediating force to calm this down, or someone, or more UN forces, or at least sent in to do something, or other forces from, a neighboring country that, may be able to stabilize the situation.
I mean, I really should have stated this in that sort of initial bit, but the really interesting aspect of if boasts is actually behind all of this, is that the group he's working with is made up of the people who ousted him in 2013. So, I mean, if there's any truth in the statement, what is he getting out of this, and what really changed all of a sudden? It is a sort of, I guess we're seeing a lot of instability flaring up in Africa as a whole, looking towards the Tigray crisis in Ethiopia, the rise of ISIS in Mozambique, and then specifically you have the instability here in the Central African Republic. And you have to think of the wider analysis of what role will the United States play in this, because Russia has their influence here. And where does this, is there any kind of diplomatic role that the United States could play in here via the United Nations possibly? Because there definitely can't be a situation like the anarchy that followed 2013 because of the widespread destruction it caused to the country and the number of people died in that ensuing situation. So there is very much the hope that no matter which countries are actually involved in the diplomatic efforts, that something can be worked out and it can be truly understood what's going on in this situation on the ground.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there are many foreign forces on the ground via the UN and other and the Russians as well. But one could only hope that there is some stability and that the current president, Faustin Archangelsk, can do something at least, to try to calm this down, because the last thing, arguably, in the middle of a global pandemic and African crises, is for a full-on disaster in the Central African Republic, as we saw in 2013. I mean, 2012, my apologies. In 2012, when the Civil War occurred, it was a very bloody and horrifying conflict occurring there.
Yes, indeed. But on a slightly lighter... I mean, it always feels inappropriate to lead the stories on to the next, everyone's favorite bit, a bit of lighter news, which we try to bring you to bring a bit of happiness to, a very despairing week in a number of ways. We come to the loser of the week. Peter, would you like to take it away first?
Sure. The loser of the week is always a fun category. What fun individual, merits it this week. And the fun individual is Friedrich Merz, the runner-up of the CDU leadership election. So why does Mr. Merz get the loser of the week? Well, first, he lost the leadership election. He underperformed his first round vote significantly in terms of delegates. But then he decided, out of a very, I don't know what, was in his head, to go on Twitter and make a lovely statement saying he would support the party and that he basically demanded to become a minister in the federal government. Now, he wanted the job as the federal minister for economics, which is a very nice and important job in Germany. This minister usually is the one that deals with economic development in Germany. Of course, Mr. Laschet is not in the position to make that appointment because he is not the prime minister. I meant the chancellor of Germany. My apologies. The current minister responsible for that, Peter Altmaier, is a longtime confidant of one Angela Merkel. Mrs. Merkel is replied in what was expected and basically told Mr. Merz to go away because it was her job as chancellor to choose the cabinet and that she was not reshuffling at all. And Mr. Laschet basically said, as much as he wants CDU unity, he would not also push for it. So Friedrich Merz loses the CDU leadership election, gets told off by two different heads of the two names of the CDU, with the new leader and the outgoing chancellor about roles. Loser of the week, and he's lost the second leadership election in 3 years, and arguably this one was his one to lose, and he blew it.
A fantastic choice right there. Now I'm going to go for a slightly cringier choice, I guess is the way to go for it. We're going to the Twitter feed of Yes Cymru, which is the group advocating for an independent Wales. Now, this group, which has roughly 45,000 followers on Twitter, uploaded a video which had Wales depicted as a female singer, and I mean borders and everything with legs and arms drawn on, singing about the fact they want to just be separate from the UK and England. Now, the reason this song is so partially bad, I mean mainly bad, is because of the actual graphic for the songs and the animation, which were, to say the least, awful, and really made the independent movement in Wales look a bit out of touch, that they think this is the way in which they should go about trying to achieve their independence. Specifically interesting because on this exact same day, a poll came out, let me find it specifically here, which showed that Welsh independence would not play out well at all. So I've just found it here. So it's from YouGov, which showed that only 29% of people think that Wales should be an independent country. So in the combination there, in which you have that with a very notoriously cringe video, which has now since been deleted from their Twitter feed, and sadly will be lost to time unless somebody's uploaded it on Twitter or elsewhere, which they probably have. Then yeah, that is a particularly cringy thing, a very loser thing, which makes them the loser of the week for me.
Always fun to see the Welsh nationalists trying to be, funny and failing miserably. Probably why they're not as successful as the Scottish nationalists.
Exactly. I mean, I guess they just as a little informal thing at the end, they've released their step forward for how they're going to achieve independence today, I believe, or at least the National have put it at their front page. Maybe it's something showing on the weekend, which basically alludes to the fact that they'll hold a legal referendum, which they dare Westminster to challenge in the courts. So it already seems like from Brexit, the UK is hurtling towards another constitutional crisis, so that it will be
on steroids.
Yeah, exactly. I don't imagine we'll see a Catalonia type response to this, but it will definitely have to be its own unique situation.
Yeah.
Who knows how it will play out?
And on that point, now the SNP, the National, which is effectively, let's be candid, the SNP's, mouthpiece in Scotland, has very much said, they're going to hold this referendum and go with it. Now, obviously, the Scotland Act of 1998 says that only Westminster can approve a referendum. It is within their right to call one. So this now sets up a very interesting dynamic of Scotland putting a referendum, but then Westminster denying it and then rolling ahead with it. What do the voters of Scotland do? Do they take the advice of the Scottish government saying, go vote in this independence, go vote for independence? Or likely the UK government saying, no, this vote's illegitimate, you don't need to show up. A fun, constitutional nightmare heading for the lovely folks up in Scotland.
Yes, and another interesting aspect that will play out here is that Scotland has their parliamentary elections coming up, so for their devolved government coming up in May. So if the SNP receive a majority, or at least some kind of coalition they can run with the Scottish Green Party, who support independence, there definitely seems like there could be that legislative battle where they say, we have the majority of the votes from the Scottish people. Let's see how Westminster responds. And to be honest, who knows how it will play into actually considering the SNP's message of Scotland merely not being listened to. Surely if Westminster was so secure about how popular they were with the Scottish people, they would allow the referendum to go forward. So another thing that will probably replace Brexit as the discourse as soon as that comes about.
Yeah, and I mean the other group that now will have to get thrown in the middle of this, because they are, of course, the group that deals with election, is the Electoral Commission. Who does the Electoral Commission take their side with? Do they take the side of the Scottish government? They take the side of the UK government. Another lovely decision for them to have to make in that case.
Yes, and then we have to throw in the other aspect, that's the Scottish Labour Party is having their leadership election. So who knows how that plays out. There are so many dynamics which we will sure to keep you in touch with as we go through the weeks. And if it does rear its head up in the news,
we will cover it.
Indeed. So I think that's a show for today.
It is. Thank you all for watching and enjoying our usual hour of international news and rundowns. As always, it's a pleasure to have Adam as my co-host and to do this every Friday.
Indeed, indeed. And make sure to, as I remember now, like, subscribe, follow us on Twitter, follow us on the places where you get your podcasts, and make sure to share us with a friend. If you know somebody who says, oh, I wonder what's going on in the world, or goes, oh, I wish I knew more, or about some of the obscure stuff that was going in the world, well, make sure to tell them about us, because I'm sure they'd love to listen.
Indeed, and thank you all for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next week at the same time. Take care.
Bye.